In the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey, staring at limestone formations that local shepherds had been using as convenient perches for centuries, never once suspecting that beneath their feet lay something that would fundamentally challenge every comfortable assumption humanity had made about its own origins. And as he brushed away the first layers of soil with hands that must have trembled with the weight of what he was beginning to understand, he could not have known that he was about to unleash evidence so profoundly disturbing to the established archaeological narrative that decades later, institutions would still be performing elaborate intellectual gymnastics to avoid confronting its implications. The site that would come to be known as Göbekli Tepe, which translates with almost prophetic irony to Potbelly Hill, emerged from the earth like an accusation carved in stone, its massive T-shaped pillars rising from the dust with the silent authority of something that had been waiting 11,600 years to prove the experts catastrophically wrong about nearly everything. The problem with Göbekli Tepe, the reason it causes such exquisite discomfort in the mahogany-panelled offices of university archaeology departments, is not merely that it is old, though its age alone should be sufficient to trigger a wholesale re-evaluation of human prehistory, but rather that it represents an impossibility made manifest, a violation of the carefully constructed timeline that places hunter-gatherers in their designated place, grunting around campfires, concerned primarily with the next meal, before the supposedly linear progression toward agriculture, then villages, then cities, then the monumental architecture that was meant to be the crowning achievement of settled, complex societies. Here, instead, standing in defiant contradiction to this neat story, is a complex of structures that predates pottery by thousands of years, that predates the invention of the wheel, that predates the development of writing and metallurgy and all the technological markers we use to distinguish civilization from what came before. And yet, these structures display such architectural sophistication, such precise astronomical alignment, such evidence of coordinated labor involving hundreds, if not thousands, of workers, that they make the carefully curated narrative of human development look less like scientific consensus and more like wishful thinking codified into dogma. The pillars themselves, those enigmatic T-shaped monoliths that stand like silent sentinels in concentric circles, weigh upward of 20 tons each. And they were not merely dragged to this hilltop from nearby quarries, though even that feat would be impressive enough for people who supposedly possessed no domesticated animals, no wheeled vehicles, no metal tools, no pulleys or levers more sophisticated than wooden poles and rope, but rather they were carved with intricate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, transported across uneven terrain, erected with precision into prepared sockets carved into bedrock, and arranged in architectural layouts that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of space, geometry, and the kind of planning that requires not just individual genius, but systematic knowledge transmitted across generations. To put this in perspective that might penetrate the comfortable numbness with which we usually regard archaeological timelines, consider that when the Great Pyramids of Giza were being constructed, Göbekli Tepe had already been standing for more than 6,000 years, had already been deliberately buried under hundreds of cubic meters of debris, in an act that itself suggests organized effort on a massive scale, and had already been forgotten by civilizations that rose and fell in the millennia between its abandonment and Egypt's Old Kingdom. This is not a matter of pushing dates back by a few centuries, the kind of minor chronological adjustment that occasionally ripples through academic journals without disturbing anyone's career trajectory, but rather a complete inversion of causality. A suggestion that monumental architecture and complex social organization came before agriculture rather than after it. That the temple preceded the farm rather than emerging as agriculture's grateful beneficiary. And this inversion creates a cascade of uncomfortable questions that current archaeological models simply cannot accommodate without collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. The standard narrative, the one still taught in universities with the confidence of settled fact, holds that hunter-gatherer societies lived hand-to-mouth existences that left no room for the kind of surplus labor required to build monuments. That only the development of agriculture created the stable food supplies and settled communities necessary for specialization, artistic production, and the complex hierarchies that could organize large-scale construction projects. Yet here is Göbekli Tepe, built by people who have left no evidence of agriculture, no evidence of permanent settlement, no pottery sherds or storage vessels, or any of the material culture we associate with sedentary life. And yet somehow these supposedly primitive nomads managed to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stone monuments that required engineering knowledge, astronomical precision, and organizational capacity that strains credulity even when attributed to later, supposedly more advanced civilizations. The truly unsettling detail, the one that transforms Göbekli Tepe from merely anomalous to actively threatening to established paradigms, is the evidence of deliberate burial. The fact that at some point, roughly 8,000 years ago, someone or some group made the decision to fill in these elaborate structures with debris, to cover them completely, to hide them from view in an act that required almost as much coordinated effort as the original construction. And this burial was not the gradual accumulation of sediment that archaeologists expect from abandoned sites, not the slow work of wind and rain and vegetation, but rather an intentional act of concealment that filled the spaces between pillars with carefully placed limestone rubble mixed with tools and animal bones, as though the entire complex were being prepared for some future discovery, preserved like a time capsule beneath the Earth's surface. The modern equivalent would be if we decided tomorrow to bury the Pentagon under a mountain of dirt, not because of conquest or disaster or natural erosion, but as a conscious choice to hide it from view. And then to ask what circumstances would drive a society to undertake such a project, what knowledge they possessed that they felt compelled to preserve in this manner, what they feared or anticipated that made this extraordinary effort seem necessary. Klaus Schmidt, who dedicated the remaining decades of his life to excavating and studying Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014, understood that he had discovered something that resisted easy categorization, something that existed in the uncomfortable space between what archaeology insisted was possible and what the physical evidence demonstrated was real. And his published work reflects the tension between rigorous documentation of what he found and the theoretical frameworks available to interpret it, between the desire to remain within the boundaries of acceptable academic discourse and the mounting evidence that those boundaries had been drawn far too narrowly. He called it a temple. And perhaps it was, though that label does little to explain the sophistication of its construction or the knowledge embedded in its layout. And he suggested it might have been built by nomadic groups who gathered periodically for ritual purposes, which at least acknowledges absence of permanent settlement, while sidestepping the question of how nomadic groups acquired the specialized knowledge and organizational capacity to execute such a project, not once, but repeatedly, across the site's estimated 1,500 years of active use, during which multiple enclosures were built, used, and subsequently filled in before new ones were constructed, suggesting not a single extraordinary effort, but rather a sustained tradition of monumental architecture maintained across dozens of generations by people who supposedly had no writing system to preserve technical knowledge and no permanent institutions to transmit it. The academic response to Göbekli Tepe has been fascinating to observe, a masterclass in institutional inertia and the human capacity for selective attention, as mainstream archaeology has largely acknowledged the site's existence. It is, after all, impossible to ignore something so physically substantial, while simultaneously minimizing its implications, treating it as an interesting outlier rather than evidence that might require fundamental revision of prehistoric timelines, relegating it to the category of anomalies that can be safely quarantined from the broader narrative without forcing any uncomfortable re-evaluations of the models that generations of scholars have built their careers upon. The terminology employed is revealing. Göbekli Tepe is exceptional, unique, extraordinary, all adjectives that function to isolate it from the general pattern, to present it as so unusual that it need not inform our understanding of the period in which it was built, as though accepting its implications would open floodgates that must remain closed, would raise questions about how many other impossible sites might exist, unexcavated or misidentified. How many other pieces of evidence have been dismissed because they didn't fit the expected pattern? How much of what we think we know about human prehistory might be projection rather than inference, comfortable stories we tell ourselves because the alternative is admitting how little we actually understand about the capabilities of our distant ancestors. The pillars stand in their circles, carved with images of animals, snakes and foxes, wild boars and aurochs, scorpions and vultures, and creatures whose significance remains opaque to modern observers despite decades of analysis. And these are not crude scratchings or primitive attempts at representation, but rather sophisticated relief carvings that demonstrate artistic skill and anatomical knowledge, that show different species in different contexts, that suggest symbolic systems whose meanings have been lost to time, but whose execution remains impressive by any standard, ancient or modern. Some of the pillars bear anthropomorphic features, suggestions of arms and hands carved into the stone, as though the T-shape itself represents a highly stylized human figure. And if this interpretation is correct, then these structures take on an even more enigmatic character, suggesting not merely architectural achievement, but symbolic expression of ideas about identity, divinity, or the relationship between human and cosmic order. Concepts that we have been taught emerge only gradually from the development of complex societies. Yet here they appear fully formed in a structure that predates those societies by thousands of years. The site continues to yield discoveries that complicate rather than clarify the picture, with geophysical surveys suggesting that what has been excavated so far represents perhaps 5% of the total complex, that beneath the soil of Potbelly Hill lie dozens more enclosures, hundreds more pillars. Who knows how many additional carvings and symbols and architectural features that might further challenge or completely overturn current interpretations. And yet, the pace of excavation remains deliberately slow, constrained by funding and academic politics, and the uncomfortable reality that every new discovery at Göbekli Tepe makes the established narrative less tenable, pushes the boundaries of what we thought possible further into territory that mainstream archaeology has spent decades dismissing as pseudoscience or fringe speculation. The irony is palpable. The very institutions charged with uncovering human history have institutional incentives to uncover it slowly, to process it through frameworks that minimize disruption to existing models, to ensure that even revolutionary evidence can be integrated into the scholarly literature without triggering revolutionary conclusions. And this tension between discovery and interpretation, between what the stones demonstrate and what the experts are willing to acknowledge, forms the subtext of every academic paper published about the site, every documentary produced, every museum exhibit that presents Göbekli Tepe to the public as a fascinating curiosity rather than the paradigm-shattering anomaly it actually represents. And then there are the symbols, those hundreds of carved markings that cover the pillars and walls, some recognizable as animals or natural forms, others geometric abstractions, still others resembling nothing in the modern visual lexicon. And these symbols present their own category of problem, because they appear to constitute some form of systematic notation, some way of recording or transmitting information that predates writing by thousands of years, yet displays characteristics of complex sign systems, patterns and repetitions that suggest meaning rather than decoration, relationships between symbols that imply grammar or syntax, or at least some organizing principle beyond random artistic expression. And these symbols, more than anything else about Göbekli Tepe, more than the impossible timeline or the engineering prowess or the organizational capacity required for construction, represent the most direct threat to comfortable narratives about human cognitive development, because they hint at sophisticated abstract thinking, at symbolic representation, at the transmission of complex ideas through visual notation. All capacities that we have been assured emerged only gradually through the slow development of settled agricultural societies. Yet, here they are, carved into stones that were old when Sumerian scribes were inventing cuneiform, ancient when Egyptian priests were developing hieroglyphs. And these symbols at Göbekli Tepe remain largely undecoded. Not because they lack significance, but because acknowledging their significance would require admitting that everything we think we know about the origins of human civilization might need to be reconsidered from the ground up. And that reconsideration, with all its implications for academic reputations and institutional authority, and the comfortable certainty with which we present the past to students and the public, is precisely what the archaeological establishment has spent 3 decades carefully avoiding. When archaeologists catalogue the carved imagery at Göbekli Tepe in their published papers and academic monographs, they tend to focus on what might be called the safe symbols, The representations of animals that can be comfortably discussed in terms of hunting practices or totemic significance. The geometric patterns that can be dismissed as decorative elements or abstract artistic expression. The broad categories of imagery that fit within established frameworks for interpreting Neolithic symbolic systems. And yet, anyone who has spent time examining the photographic record from the site, comparing images across different publications and documentary footage, cross-referencing the official archaeological reports with the thousands of photographs taken by visitors and researchers over the past 3 decades, begins to notice a curious pattern of omission, a selective attention that highlights certain types of symbols while allowing others to fade into the background of academic discussion, mentioned perhaps in passing or relegated to footnotes, treated as peripheral curiosities rather than central mysteries demanding explanation. The official count suggests there are somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct carved symbols at Göbekli Tepe, depending on how one categorizes variations and repetitions. Yet the mainstream archaeological literature focuses its analytical attention on perhaps 50 of these, returning again and again to the same reliefs of foxes and boars and birds, the same geometric arrangements that can be safely interpreted through the lens of ritual practice or shamanistic tradition. While a substantial portion of the site's symbolic vocabulary exists in a strange limbo of photographic documentation without serious interpretive engagement, as though acknowledging certain symbols would require addressing questions that the field is not yet prepared to confront. Among the imagery that receives comparatively little attention in mainstream discourse, despite its prominence at the site, is what has come to be known among alternative researchers as the handbag motif, a recurring symbol that appears carved into several pillars at Göbekli Tepe, and bears a striking resemblance to similar imagery found in Sumerian reliefs from thousands of years later, in Egyptian temple carvings, separated by vast distances and supposed cultural isolation. In Mesoamerican art, from civilizations that emerged on entirely different continents millennia after Göbekli Tepe was buried. And this symbol, which appears to represent a rectangular container or bucket with a curved handle, held by anthropomorphic figures, presents exactly the kind of cross-cultural pattern that should fascinate archaeologists interested in the transmission of ideas or the independent emergence of similar symbolic systems. Yet it tends to be mentioned only briefly, if at all, in the official literature, dismissed when it is. Acknowledged as coincidence or convergent evolution in symbolic thinking, explained away through appeals to the limited number of ways that human hands can represent containers, or the universal human experience of carrying objects. Rationalizations that become increasingly strained when one considers the specific consistency of the representation across vast spans of time and space. The handbag motif appears not as a vague similarity, but as a remarkably specific icon, with the same proportions and positioning, the same association with figures who appear to possess special status or knowledge, the same context of monumental architecture and astronomical alignment, and the statistical probability that such a specific symbol would emerge independently in cultures separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, appearing in contexts that suggest similar meanings or functions, strains the limits of what coincidence can reasonably explain. Yet, acknowledging this pattern would require entertaining possibilities about cultural transmission or shared knowledge bases that do not fit comfortably within the isolated development model that dominates archaeological thinking about ancient civilizations. The anthropomorphic figures themselves, those enigmatic carved beings that appear repeatedly throughout the Göbekli Tepe complex, present their own interpretive challenges that mainstream archaeology addresses primarily through recourse to ritual and shamanistic frameworks, suggesting these might be representations of spirits or ancestors or mythological beings. Explanations that are conveniently unfalsifiable and allow scholars to check the box marked interpreted without actually explaining much of anything about why these figures appear as they do, why they possess the specific features they display, why they are positioned in particular relationships to other symbols and architectural elements. Some of these figures, carved with what can only be described as oversized eyes relative to their facial features, with elongated heads and postures that seem simultaneously human and distinctly other, have earned the designation of watchers among researchers willing to engage with their more unsettling aspects. And these watchers appear not randomly scattered across the pillars, but in positions that suggest intentional placement, observing or overseeing specific enclosures or specific arrangements of other symbols, their gaze directed in ways that correspond to astronomical alignments or sightlines that connect different parts of the complex. The temptation among mainstream archaeologists is to interpret these as representations of shamans in ritual costume or masks, which may indeed be part of the explanation. Yet, this interpretation does little to address why such representations would be given such prominence in a monumental structure that required extraordinary effort to construct. Why the watchers appear in consistent relationship to other symbolic elements across different enclosures built at different times. Why their presence seems to be architecturally integrated rather than merely decorative. Questions that become more pressing when one considers that these figures appear in one of humanity's oldest known examples of monumental architecture, suggesting that whatever they represented was considered important enough to warrant preservation in stone, at a time when such preservation was extraordinarily difficult, and presumably reserved for the most significant concepts or beings or ideas that the builders wished to communicate across time. The astronomical dimensions of Göbekli Tepe's symbolism represent another area where official interpretations tend toward vagueness, despite increasingly compelling evidence that the builders possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the analysis of what has become known as Pillar 43, sometimes called the vulture stone, which displays a complex arrangement of animal symbols that researchers from fields outside archaeology, astronomers, statisticians, engineers approaching the problem with different methodological assumptions, have argued represents a star map or astronomical notation corresponding to a specific date, roughly 11,600 years ago, coinciding almost precisely with the beginning of the Younger Dryas impact event, a period of catastrophic climate change that saw global temperatures plummet and megafauna extinctions accelerate across continents. The pillar shows a vulture with outstretched wings, positioned above a circle or disc, surrounded by other animals, including a scorpion, a goat or ibex, and various geometric symbols. And when these are mapped onto the positions of constellations as they would have appeared in the night sky during the late Younger Dryas period, the correlations are statistically significant enough to suggest either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate astronomical recording. Yet mainstream archaeology remains deeply reluctant to embrace this interpretation, despite its explanatory power, preferring instead to classify the pillar as having ritual significance or representing shamanistic symbolism, catch-all categories that have become archaeology's intellectual escape hatches, the academic equivalent of shrugging and moving on to safer topics that don't threaten established chronologies of human knowledge development. The resistance to astronomical interpretations of Göbekli Tepe's symbolism reflects a broader pattern in archaeological thinking that treats ancient peoples as fundamentally less capable of abstract reasoning or systematic observation than modern humans, a kind of temporal condescension that assumes sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics must be a late development in human cognitive evolution, rather than a potential constant across our species' history, available to any human population with clear skies and sufficient motivation to observe patterns over generations. Yet, this assumption crumbles when confronted with the mathematical precision of Göbekli Tepe's construction, the alignment of its enclosures to specific celestial events, the recurrence of symbols that correspond to astronomical phenomena in ways that become increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence the more carefully one examines the relationships. The site's main axis aligns with the summer solstice sunrise with a precision that requires intentional planning and accurate measurement. The circular arrangement of pillars in the main enclosures creates sightlines that correspond to the rising and setting positions of specific stars during the period of construction, and the geometric relationships between different structures within the complex suggest knowledge of mathematical principles that supposedly would not be discovered for thousands of years, creating a knowledge problem that mainstream archaeology addresses primarily by not addressing it at all. By focusing instead on pottery fragments and animal bones and other material evidence that can be safely analyzed within existing frameworks without raising uncomfortable questions about how much these supposedly primitive people actually understood about the cosmos and their place within it. Beyond the recognizable imagery of animals and astronomical symbols lie categories of carved marks that resist easy classification. Abstract designs that appear throughout the site in patterns suggesting systematic notation rather than decorative impulse. And these symbols present perhaps the most direct challenge to narratives about the gradual development of writing and symbolic representation, because they display characteristics that, in any later context, would be recognized as proto-writing, or, at minimum, as complex sign systems intended to record or transmit specific information. Some of these marks appear in sequences, arrangements that suggest grammatical structure, with certain symbols consistently preceding or following others, in ways that imply rules of combination, relationships between signs that hint at syntax or semantic categories, while other symbols appear in isolation, but with such frequency and consistency of form that they seem to represent standardized signs within a shared symbolic vocabulary, repeated across different enclosures and different periods of construction, in ways that indicate transmission of knowledge about their proper form and, presumably, their meaning. The conventional archaeological position holds that writing emerged gradually from accounting practices in early agricultural societies, developing first as simple tokens or marks to record quantities of goods, then evolving slowly toward the representation of language and abstract concepts. Yet here, at Göbekli Tepe, thousands of years before agriculture supposedly created the need for accounting systems, we find symbolic notation that displays complexity and systematization that should not exist according to this developmental model. And the response from mainstream archaeology has been largely to avoid engaging with these symbols as a potential writing system, to classify them instead as decorative elements or ritual markings, categories that allow scholars to acknowledge their existence without confronting the implications of their sophistication. The geometric symbols scattered throughout Göbekli Tepe include designs that bear uncanny resemblance to technical diagrams or schematics, angular arrangements and precise curves that look less like artistic expression and more like engineering notation, representations of relationships or processes that defy interpretation through the ritual and mythological frameworks that archaeology typically applies to prehistoric imagery. And these symbols exist in uncomfortable proximity to the site's demonstrated engineering achievements, creating a feedback loop of evidence that becomes increasingly difficult to explain away through appeals to lucky accidents or intuitive genius. Consider that moving a 20-ton limestone pillar from quarry to construction site without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or domesticated animals requires not just brute strength, but careful planning, understanding of leverage and friction, knowledge of stone properties and breaking points, calculation of forces and angles. Precisely the kind of technical knowledge that one might choose to record and preserve through visual notation if one possessed no writing system in the conventional sense. And yet, when archaeologists encounter symbols that might represent such technical knowledge, the tendency is to interpret them through frameworks designed for analyzing religious or mythological content. To ask what these symbols meant in terms of ritual practice, rather than what practical information they might have been designed to preserve and transmit across generations of builders who needed to maintain and expand the complex over more than a millennium of active use. The pattern recognition problem that Göbekli Tepe presents extends beyond individual symbols to encompass the relationships between different types of imagery within the site, and the appearance of similar or identical symbols in other contexts separated by enormous spans of time and distance. And this is where mainstream archaeology's reluctance to engage becomes most pronounced, most obviously motivated by concerns beyond pure interpretation of evidence. Because acknowledging these patterns would require either accepting improbable coincidence as explanation or entertaining possibilities about cultural transmission, shared heritage, or preservation of knowledge from earlier civilizations that do not fit within the isolated development model that has dominated archaeological thinking for more than a century. When the same specific symbols appear in Göbekli Tepe, in later Sumerian temples, in Egyptian sacred architecture, in Mesoamerican pyramids, always in contexts suggesting astronomical knowledge and monumental construction, always associated with imagery of beings or figures that seem to possess or transmit special knowledge, the probability that these represent independent invention decreases with each additional correlation. Yet, the alternative, that there might be connections across time and space that our current historical models do not account for, that knowledge might have been preserved and transmitted through channels we have not yet recognized, that the isolated development of ancient civilizations might be less isolated than we have assumed. This alternative carries implications that threaten not just specific archaeological interpretations, but entire frameworks of understanding about how human civilization developed. Frameworks that universities have spent generations building, that museums have organized their collections around, that countless academic careers and institutional reputations depend upon remaining essentially correct in their broad outlines, even if details require adjustment. The ritual object designation has become archaeology's universal solvent, the explanation deployed whenever artifacts or symbols resist interpretation through materialist frameworks. And at Göbekli Tepe, this tendency reaches almost parodic proportions, as increasingly sophisticated symbolic systems are relegated to the category of religious expression, as though calling something ritual somehow explains it, rather than simply creating a category for things we do not understand, while maintaining the illusion that we have explained them. And this habit of thought reveals more about the limitations of archaeological methodology than it does about the minds of the people who carved these symbols into stone 11,000 years ago. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were solving complex engineering problems, organizing labor on a scale that required sophisticated social structures, observing and recording astronomical phenomena with enough precision to align massive stone structures to specific celestial events, creating symbolic systems complex enough to require standardization and transmission across generations. And all of this activity gets compressed into the explanatory category of ritual, as though ritual were somehow separate from or opposed to practical knowledge, as though ancient peoples divided their activities into the rational and the religious in the same way modern secular academics do, as though the symbols carved with such evident care and precision into pillars that were meant to stand for millennia could not possibly encode technical information or systematic observation, simply because they appear in a structure that archaeology has decided to classify as a temple, a classification that itself begs the question of what temples were for in a world before the religious and secular had been conceptually separated, before the practical and spiritual had been divided into distinct domains requiring different interpretive approaches. And so the symbols remain, hundreds of them, carved into stone with intention and precision, arranged in patterns that suggest meaning, repeated across enclosures in ways that indicate systematic knowledge. Yet the vast majority of them exist in archaeological limbo, photographed and catalogued, but not deeply analyzed, acknowledged, but not explained, visible in the documentary record, yet curiously absent from the theoretical frameworks that mainstream archaeology applies to Göbekli Tepe. And this selective attention, this curious reluctance to engage fully with the symbolic vocabulary that covers the site's pillars and walls, raises questions not just about what these symbols meant to their creators, but about what it means that we cannot, or will not, attempt to decode them seriously. About what structures of thought and institutional incentive led experts to focus intensely on some aspects of the evidence, while allowing other aspects to fade into background noise. About whether the project of understanding our distant past has been compromised by the need to make that past conform to narratives that protect present-day assumptions about the nature and timing of human cognitive development. And these questions lead, inevitably, to deeper inquiries about what knowledge the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed, where that knowledge came from, and why so much effort was invested in preserving it in the most permanent medium available to a people who carved their message into stone, so that it might outlast whatever catastrophes or changes were coming. A topic that demands exploration of the knowledge problem that Göbekli Tepe represents, the impossible sophistication that its builders demonstrated, and the uncomfortable implications of expertise appearing fully formed, without the developmental phase that our models of human progress insist must have preceded it. The numbers themselves are difficult for the modern mind to comprehend with any real emotional weight, the kind of deep time that collapses into abstraction when we try to hold it in our thoughts. But consider that when the first stones of the Great Pyramid at Giza were being laid under the desert sun of Egypt's fourth dynasty, Göbekli Tepe had already been standing and had already been deliberately buried and forgotten for more than 7,000 years, a span of time greater than the entire distance between the construction of those pyramids and our present moment. And this means that Göbekli Tepe was as ancient to the pyramid builders as the pyramids are to us, except that the Egyptian architects, at least, had oral traditions and written records, and the accumulated knowledge of previous dynasties to build upon, whereas the people who erected the massive T-shaped pillars on that Turkish hillside appear to have possessed sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge that materialized in the archaeological record, essentially without precedent, without the developmental scaffolding of earlier, simpler attempts that we would expect to find if this knowledge had been laboriously acquired through generations of trial and error, rather than inherited from some earlier source that our current historical models do not account for. When Stonehenge was being constructed on the Salisbury Plain, an achievement that required coordinating labour and moving massive stones and aligning structures to celestial events in ways that continue to impress modern observers, the builders were working 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe, separated from it by a gulf of time so vast that any direct cultural transmission seems impossible. Yet the similarities in architectural ambition and astronomical precision suggest either remarkable coincidence or the preservation and transmission of knowledge through channels and across time spans that conventional archaeology has not yet recognized or refuses to acknowledge, because doing so would require admitting that our linear model of human development, with its neat progression from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, might be less a description of how things actually happened and more a comforting story we tell ourselves to make the fragmentary evidence conform to assumptions about progress and cultural evolution that owe more to Victorian-era social theory than to careful analysis of what the stones and symbols actually demonstrate. The timeline problem that Göbekli Tepe presents becomes even more acute when we consider the period during which it was built and actively used, which corresponds almost exactly to the Younger Dryas, a geological epoch that lasted from approximately 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago, and represents one of the most dramatic climate events in recent planetary history. A sudden return to near-glacial conditions that interrupted the general warming trend following the last ice age and caused catastrophic changes across the globe. Mass extinctions of megafauna, radical disruptions to weather patterns, sea level changes, and environmental chaos that would have made survival challenging for human populations anywhere on Earth. Yet, during this period of planetary crisis, someone was investing enormous resources and coordinated labor into constructing monumental architecture on an Anatolian hillside, suggesting either that this region was somehow sheltered from the worst effects of the climate catastrophe, or that the construction of Göbekli Tepe was itself a response to that catastrophe, an attempt to preserve knowledge or mark the significance of events in the most permanent way available to a people who had witnessed something so profound that it demanded commemoration in stone that would outlast any conceivable future disaster. The evidence from ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica, from sediment layers extracted from lake beds and ocean floors, from geological formations across continents, all points to a period of rapid and severe climate change beginning around 12,800 years ago. And increasingly, this evidence is being interpreted in conjunction with impact craters and a layer of nanodiamonds and other exotic materials found in the geological record at precisely this date, suggesting that the Younger Dryas may have been triggered not by gradual climate processes, but by a cosmic impact event, possibly a comet fragmenting in Earth's atmosphere and creating multiple airbursts and impacts that would have been visible across much of the Northern Hemisphere, that would have caused immediate devastation in impact zones and longer-term climate effects as debris thrown into the atmosphere blocked sunlight and disrupted weather patterns for more than a millennium. The hypothesis that Göbekli Tepe might have been built by survivors of a pre-Younger Dryas civilization, that it represents not the beginning of monumental architecture and complex society, but rather the end point of an earlier cultural tradition, now largely lost to us because most of its remains lie beneath risen seas or were obliterated by the climate catastrophe itself. This hypothesis has the virtue of actually explaining the site's impossible sophistication, its lack of developmental precursors, the fully formed nature of its architectural and astronomical knowledge. Yet this explanation remains relegated to the margins of archaeological discourse, despite its explanatory power, because accepting it would require acknowledging that there might have been advanced civilizations before the ones we have built our chronologies around, that the narrative of continuous progress from primitive origins might need to be replaced with a more complex model, involving cycles of development and collapse, preservation and loss, sophistication achieved and then forgotten, only to be laboriously rediscovered millennia later by peoples who had no memory of what their distant ancestors once knew. The standard model holds that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago with the Sumerians, spread from there to Egypt and the Indus Valley and eventually around the world. A model that treats earlier periods as essentially preparatory, as humanity slowly acquiring the skills and knowledge necessary for civilization proper to emerge. But Göbekli Tepe sits stubbornly outside this narrative. 7,000 years older than Sumer, displaying capabilities that should not exist in hunter-gatherer populations, forcing a choice between expanding our definition of what pre-agricultural peoples could accomplish, or reconsidering whether the agricultural revolution was truly the watershed moment in human development that we have assumed it to be. Whether it might, instead, mark a recovery phase following a period of catastrophic loss, during which surviving populations had to rebuild from fragments of earlier knowledge. And this possibility, which treats agriculture not as the brilliant discovery that launched civilization, but as the desperate adaptation that allowed post-catastrophe populations to sustain themselves and eventually recover some of what had been lost, inverts the entire structure of assumptions upon which conventional archaeology has built its understanding of the Neolithic period. The timing of Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial, occurring around the same period when agriculture begins to appear in the archaeological record of the Fertile Crescent, presents another chronological puzzle that mainstream interpretations struggle to address satisfactorily. Because the conventional explanation, that the site was abandoned as people transitioned to agricultural lifestyles and no longer needed or valued the communal gathering place that Göbekli Tepe represented, does not account for the extraordinary effort involved in burying the structures, effort that would have required coordinating labor on a scale comparable to the original construction, moving hundreds of cubic meters of limestone debris and soil to fill the spaces between pillars and cover the entire complex. Work that took years, if not decades, to complete, and represented a significant investment of resources and time by people who, supposedly, were too busy developing agricultural techniques to maintain their old ritual centers, unless the burial was itself ritualistic. Unless covering Göbekli Tepe was not abandonment but preservation, not forgetting but deliberate concealment, hiding something precious beneath the earth in anticipation of future recovery, or as protection against future threats. And this interpretation gains credence when we consider that the burial appears to have been done carefully, almost tenderly, filling the structures in ways that protected the pillars from damage rather than simply demolishing them, suggesting that what was being hidden was considered valuable enough to warrant the effort of preservation, even as the people responsible were transitioning to new ways of life that no longer included active use of the site. The discovery of additional sites across Turkey and the broader region, structures that share architectural and symbolic characteristics with Göbekli Tepe, and that keep pushing the chronology of monumental architecture further back into the past, compounds the timeline problem, because each new site that emerges from excavation, Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepe, Sayburç, and others, demonstrates that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader cultural tradition, a civilization or network of related cultures that possessed sophisticated knowledge and building capabilities across a wide geographic area during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. And this recognition transforms the question from how one impossible site could exist to how an entire cultural sphere could achieve this level of sophistication so early in the conventionally understood timeline of human development. How knowledge and techniques could be shared across distances that would have required complex social networks and communication systems. How symbolic vocabularies could remain consistent enough to be recognizable across different sites, while still showing local variations that suggest individual communities rather than centralized control. Questions that require us to imagine pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolia not as a scattering of isolated hunter-gatherer bands occasionally coming together for ritual purposes, but as a landscape of interconnected communities, sharing knowledge, trading ideas, maintaining traditions across generations and distances, in ways that imply social complexity that our models insist should not have existed without the agricultural surplus that enables specialization and the development of administrative hierarchies and all the other features we associate with civilization in the conventional sense. The concept of forbidden archaeology, a term that has been unfortunately associated with fringe theories and pseudo-scientific claims, nonetheless captures something real about the way that evidence which does not fit within accepted chronological frameworks tends to be treated by mainstream academic institutions, not with careful analysis aimed at understanding why the evidence exists and what it might mean for our models of the past, but with dismissal, minimization, or selective attention that allows uncomfortable data points to be acknowledged without being integrated into the broader narrative. And Göbekli Tepe represents perhaps the most prominent example of this phenomenon. Because while the site itself is now recognized and studied, its implications are carefully contained, described as exceptional rather than as evidence requiring systematic re-evaluation of what we know. Thought we knew about the period in which it was built, treated as an outlier that proves the rule, rather than as a data point suggesting the rule itself might be wrong. The academic career incentives that reward incremental refinement of existing models and punish paradigm-threatening reinterpretation create an institutional environment where the safest approach to anomalous evidence is to acknowledge it exists while minimizing its significance, to study its details exhaustively while avoiding the broader theoretical questions it raises, to publish careful descriptions of what is found while remaining silent on what those findings might mean for the chronological frameworks that organize our understanding of human prehistory. And this dynamic means that evidence like Göbekli Tepe can be simultaneously well documented and poorly understood, visible in the literature, yet somehow invisible in its implications, known to every archaeologist working on the Neolithic period, yet still not integrated into the narrative that those same archaeologists present to students, the public, and each other when discussing how civilization developed and what capacities human populations possessed at different points in our species' history. The generational dimension of this resistance to chronological revision cannot be ignored, because academic careers that began with certain assumptions about the timing and development of human civilization, that produced dissertations and monographs and decades of publications, all built upon those assumptions, have a great deal invested in those assumptions remaining essentially correct, even if details require adjustment. And this creates a situation where the scholars with the most expertise and institutional authority are often the ones least able to objectively evaluate evidence that threatens the frameworks they have spent their professional lives constructing and defending, while younger researchers, who might be more willing to question orthodoxy, lack the institutional power to challenge established narratives without risking their career prospects in a field where academic positions are scarce and tenure committees are composed of the same senior scholars whose work would be implicitly challenged by any serious reinterpretation of sites like Göbekli Tepe. The result is a kind of institutional paralysis, where everyone involved can see that the evidence does not fit the models, but no one with the authority to revise the models has the incentive to do so. And so, the models persist, taught to new generations of students, presented in textbooks and museum exhibits, defended in peer review against papers that suggest alternative interpretations, maintaining themselves through institutional momentum, even as the evidence against them accumulates with each new excavation season, each new dating result, each new discovery that pushes the boundaries of what we thought possible further into territory that the conventional chronology insists should be impossible. The implications of taking Göbekli Tepe's timeline seriously, of actually integrating its existence and characteristics into our models of human development, rather than treating it as an exceptional outlier, would require reconsidering not just when certain capabilities emerged, but how we think about the relationship between technology, social organization, and knowledge across deep time. Because if monumental architecture and sophisticated astronomical observation and complex symbolic systems could exist 11,600 years ago in populations we classify as hunter-gatherers, then the whole edifice of assumptions about what capabilities correlate with what subsistence strategies and what social structures crumbles. And we are left with the uncomfortable recognition that human cognitive capacity and the potential for sophisticated cultural achievement has probably been constant across our species' history. That what varies is not fundamental capability, but rather the circumstances that allow that capability to find expression. The preservation of knowledge across generations, the survival of populations through catastrophic events, the maintenance of complex traditions through periods of environmental and social stress. And this recognition, in turn, raises the question of how much knowledge might have been lost during the Younger Dryas and other catastrophic periods. How many times human populations might have achieved sophistication only to have it obliterated by events beyond their control, leaving only fragments and anomalies like Göbekli Tepe to hint at what was once known and has since been forgotten, raising the disturbing possibility that our current civilization, with all its technology and accumulated knowledge, might represent not the apex of human achievement, but merely the latest recovery phase following the most recent catastrophe, and that the builders of Göbekli Tepe, who saw fit to bury their knowledge in stone and earth as protection against whatever they feared was coming, understood something about the cyclical nature of human history that we, in our confidence about linear progress and continuous advancement, have yet to relearn. And this understanding, this recognition that the timeline we have constructed might be less an accurate map of human development and more a provisional sketch based on the fragmentary evidence that happened to survive and the assumptions we brought to interpreting it, leads inevitably to questions about what those builders were trying to protect, what knowledge they possessed that seemed worth preserving at such extraordinary cost, and whether the symbols they carved into stone with such evident care might encode more than ritual significance, might represent systematic knowledge about astronomy, engineering, mathematics, or other domains that our current interpretive frameworks are not equipped to recognize, because we approach these symbols with the assumption that people 11,600 years ago could not possibly have possessed such knowledge, creating a circular logic where the chronology prevents us from seeing evidence that would require revising the chronology, and breaking out of this circle requires confronting not just the timeline problem, but the knowledge problem itself. The question of what the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually knew, and how they came to know it. Topics that demand examination of the sophistication demonstrated in every aspect of the site's construction and operation. Sophistication that appears fully formed, without the developmental phase our models insist must have preceded it, suggesting either that the development occurred earlier than our models account for, or that knowledge can be transmitted across time through means we have not yet recognized, preserved through catastrophes that destroy most evidence of earlier cultures, but leave just enough fragments to indicate that something more complex than our narratives acknowledge was occurring in the deep past, if only we had the courage to look at the evidence without the blinders of chronological assumptions that were established before sites like Göbekli Tepe were even discovered. Before we knew that monumental architecture could exist in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Before we had to confront the reality that human capability and human knowledge might not follow the neat developmental trajectories that make for clean textbook narratives and comfortable academic careers, but instead might be subject to losses and recoveries, catastrophes and preservations, cycles of sophistication and collapse that leave the archaeological record looking far more fragmentary and confusing than the confident timeline presented in introductory archaeology courses would suggest. The question that haunts the margins of every academic conference where Göbekli Tepe is discussed, that lurks unspoken beneath the carefully worded abstracts and peer-reviewed publications, that manifests in the curious silences and selective attention that characterize mainstream archaeological engagement with the site's most challenging features, is not ultimately about what the symbols mean, or how the structures were built, or even when human civilization actually began, but rather about what happens to the entire edifice of archaeological authority, to the careers and reputations and institutional frameworks that have been constructed over more than a century of scholarship. If it turns out that the fundamental narrative about human development that has been taught to generations of students and presented to the public with the confident authority of scientific consensus is not merely incomplete or slightly wrong in its details, but fundamentally mistaken in its basic assumptions about the timing, nature, and progression of human cultural achievement. The system of academic archaeology, as it currently exists, is not designed to accommodate revolutionary reinterpretation of evidence, despite the field's nominal commitment to scientific methodology and the principle that theories should be revised in light of new data. Because the practical reality of how academic institutions function, the tenure system that rewards incremental refinement of established models, the grant mechanisms that fund projects likely to produce results that can be integrated into existing frameworks, the peer review processes that favor papers conforming to methodological orthodoxy, the textbook publication cycles that create momentum behind particular narratives that become increasingly difficult to revise as they become embedded in educational infrastructure, creates powerful structural incentives to minimize, rather than explore, the implications of evidence that threatens to overturn settled interpretations. And these incentives operate largely unconsciously, not as deliberate conspiracy to suppress truth, but as the accumulated weight of institutional inertia, career self-preservation, and the very human reluctance to admit that one's life's work might have been built on foundations that require fundamental reassessment. The fate of researchers who have challenged archaeological orthodoxy too directly provides instructive cautionary tales that resonate through the field with the force of mythology, creating an environment where even tenured professors think carefully before publishing interpretations that stray too far from acceptable positions. And while the most dramatic examples of career destruction tend to involve researchers who ventured into territories that mainstream archaeology considers pseudoscientific, ancient astronaut theories, Atlantean civilization, catastrophist scenarios that sound too much like biblical flood narratives, the boundary between legitimate inquiry and career-threatening speculation is maintained not through explicit rules, but through the informal social mechanisms of professional reputation, conference invitations, grant approvals, and the subtle signals of approval or disapproval that senior scholars direct toward junior colleagues whose work either reinforces or challenges the prevailing consensus. A graduate student who proposes a dissertation interpreting Göbekli Tepe's symbols as evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge transmitted from an earlier civilization will find fewer willing advisors than one who proposes studying the site's animal bones to better understand Neolithic hunting practices. Not necessarily because the former question is less interesting or less supported by evidence, but because pursuing it marks the student as potentially unserious, willing to flirt with fringe ideas, insufficiently socialized into the methodological conservatism that characterizes respectable archaeological scholarship. And this informal gatekeeping, operating through 1,000 small decisions about who gets funded and published and hired, ensures that the most challenging interpretations of anomalous evidence remain largely unexplored by the scholars with the training and resources to explore them most rigorously, creating a perverse situation where the people best equipped to investigate revolutionary possibilities are the ones with the strongest professional incentives not to do so. The labeling tactics employed by mainstream archaeology to dismiss uncomfortable evidence or interpretations reveal much about how disciplinary boundaries are maintained and orthodoxy is protected. Because the term fringe or pseudo-archaeology functions not as a description of methodological quality, but as a social marker, indicating that certain ideas have been placed beyond the pale of acceptable academic discourse. And this marking occurs not through careful demonstration that the ideas in question are empirically wrong or logically flawed, but through association with other ideas that have been deemed unacceptable, creating a kind of guilt by conceptual proximity, where any interpretation that sounds too much like something a non-credentialed researcher might propose becomes automatically suspect, regardless of the evidence supporting it. The irony is that many interpretations that are now relegated to fringe status, the idea that catastrophic events might have shaped human prehistory, that ancient peoples possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, that cultural transmission might have occurred across greater distances and time spans than the isolated development model acknowledges, are becoming increasingly supported by evidence from multiple disciplines, including geology, astronomy, genetics, and even mainstream archaeology's own findings. Yet the social stigma attached to these ideas, the association with researchers and writers who lack proper academic credentials, or who have made claims that went beyond what evidence could support, creates a barrier that prevents even well-supported versions of these interpretations from receiving serious consideration within academic institutions. And this dynamic means that the field systematically avoids certain lines of inquiry, not because they have been investigated and found wanting, but because investigating them seriously would require associating oneself with ideas and people that the field has collectively agreed to marginalize, a decision that no individual career-minded researcher can afford to make, regardless of what the evidence actually suggests. The implications of seriously engaging with Göbekli Tepe's symbolic systems, of attempting to decode them with the assumption that they might encode sophisticated knowledge rather than merely ritual significance, extend far beyond the specific question of what these particular symbols meant to their creators. Because if the symbols at Göbekli Tepe can be shown to represent systematic astronomical observation, mathematical relationships, technical knowledge about engineering or geology, other domains, then the entire framework for interpreting symbolic systems from other pre-literate cultures would need to be reconsidered. And the thousands of artifacts that have been catalogued as ritual objects or fertility symbols or shamanic paraphernalia might need to be re-examined, with the possibility that they encode practical knowledge, systematic observations, technical information that was preserved in visual form by cultures that possessed sophisticated understanding of their world, but lacked the alphabetic writing systems we typically associate with advanced knowledge. And this re-examination would be a monumental undertaking that would call into question decades of published interpretations, would require museums to reconsider how they present ancient cultures to the public, would demand new methodological approaches that treat ancient symbolic systems with the seriousness we accord to later writing systems, rather than assuming that anything pre-alphabetic must be primarily mythological or religious in nature. The institutional investment in existing interpretations, the sheer number of publications and exhibitions and educational materials that would need to be revised, the potential embarrassment of having classified technical knowledge as ritual objects for generations, creates a powerful, if unspoken, incentive to avoid pursuing interpretations that would require such wholesale reassessment. And so, the symbols remain largely undecoded. Not because decoding them is impossible, but because successfully decoding them would be too disruptive to the comfortable narratives that currently organize our understanding of ancient cultures and their capabilities. What we lose by not investigating these possibilities seriously, by maintaining methodological conservatism that protects existing paradigms at the cost of potentially revolutionary insights, extends beyond academic questions about the past to include practical knowledge that might prove useful in our own time. Because if ancient cultures possessed sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, materials science, or other technical domains, and if they encoded that understanding in symbolic systems that we have dismissed as primitive art or religious iconography, then we may be surrounded by information sources that could inform modern research and development, if only we approached them with the assumption that ancient peoples might have understood aspects of the natural world that we are still discovering or rediscovering. And this possibility, which sounds almost mystical in its suggestion that lost knowledge might be recovered from ancient symbols, actually rests on the quite reasonable proposition that human cognitive capacity has been essentially constant for tens of thousands of years, that different cultures have pursued knowledge in different domains based on their particular needs and circumstances, and that catastrophic events or cultural collapses can result in the loss of knowledge that was once widespread, leaving only fragmentary evidence in the form of symbols and structures whose significance is no longer understood by the cultures that inherit them. The builders of Göbekli Tepe demonstrated understanding of astronomical relationships, structural engineering, geological properties of stone, organizational principles for coordinating large-scale labor, and symbolic representation sophisticated enough to transmit information across generations. And these capabilities suggest that other domains of knowledge might have been developed to similar levels of sophistication, that what survives in the archaeological record might represent only a fraction of what was once known, and that approaching ancient symbolic systems with the assumption that they might encode genuine knowledge rather than merely mythological expression could yield insights that would benefit contemporary understanding in multiple fields, from archaeoastronomy to traditional ecological knowledge, to engineering principles that ancient builders discovered through experimentation and preserved through visual notation that we have not yet learned to read because we approach it with the wrong assumptions about what pre-literate peoples could have known or accomplished. The cost of being wrong in academia, of publishing interpretations that later prove to be unsupported by evidence, is measured not just in professional embarrassment, but in concrete career consequences. Denied tenure, revoked grant funding, exclusion from prestigious publications and conferences, relegation to the margins of one's field. And these consequences are severe enough that they encourage extreme conservatism in interpretation, a bias toward conventional explanations, even when the evidence points toward more revolutionary possibilities. Because the professional penalty for being wrong in an unorthodox way is far greater than the penalty for being wrong in a way that conforms to existing paradigms. And this asymmetry in risk creates a systematic bias in which direction errors tend to fall, encouraging interpretations that minimize rather than maximize the sophistication and knowledge of ancient peoples, that attribute to luck or accident or ritual behavior what might more accurately be attributed to systematic knowledge and intentional design, that prefer explanations requiring less revision of existing chronologies and models, even when those explanations require positing extraordinary coincidences or convergent evolution of remarkably specific symbolic systems across vast spans of time and distance. The researcher who suggests that Göbekli Tepe's astronomical alignments are coincidental, or that its symbols are purely decorative, might be wrong. But being wrong in this way carries no career risk because it conforms to methodological conservatism and does not threaten established narratives. Whereas the researcher who suggests that the site represents preservation of knowledge from an earlier civilization, even if this interpretation ultimately proves correct, takes a career risk by venturing into territory that the field has collectively marked as beyond acceptable discourse. And this asymmetry in professional consequences ensures that the field systematically underestimates, rather than overestimates, the capabilities and knowledge of ancient cultures. That errors tend to fall in the direction of attributing less, rather than more, sophistication to prehistoric peoples, creating a built-in bias that has shaped the entire narrative of human development toward models that emphasize gradual progression and isolated development, while minimizing evidence of sophisticated knowledge appearing earlier than those models predict, or being transmitted across greater distances than isolated development would allow. The generational shift currently underway in archaeology, as older scholars who built their careers on particular chronological and interpretive frameworks retire, and younger researchers less invested in defending those frameworks enter the field, offers some hope that evidence like Göbekli Tepe might receive more open-minded investigation in coming decades. Because the new generation of archaeologists has grown up with the knowledge that sophisticated monumental architecture existed in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, that hunter-gatherer societies were capable of organizational and technical achievements previously attributed only to agricultural civilizations, that the neat developmental progression from simple to complex that older textbooks presented as established fact is considerably more complicated and messy than those textbooks acknowledged. And this generational shift in baseline assumptions means that interpretations which would have seemed radical or career-threatening to scholars trained in the mid-20th century might seem merely interesting or worthy of investigation to researchers whose foundational education included Göbekli Tepe as a known data point rather than an anomaly to be explained away. The resistance to new interpretations comes primarily from scholars with decades of investment in older models who have published extensively within those frameworks and whose professional reputations are tied to the essential correctness of interpretations they have defended throughout their careers, while younger researchers who have not yet built such extensive publication records, or whose early training incorporated newer evidence, might be more willing to pursue interpretations that their senior colleagues would consider too risky. And this generational dynamic suggests that the gatekeeping mechanisms that currently limit investigation of Göbekli Tepe's more challenging aspects might gradually weaken as the field's demographic composition shifts, as peer review panels and grant committees and tenure committees come to include more members whose careers were not built on the chronological and interpretive frameworks that Göbekli Tepe threatens. Though whether this shift will occur quickly enough to capitalize on current excavation and documentation work, or whether institutional inertia will prevent significant reinterpretation for another generation, remains to be seen. The symbols carved into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe remain, and this is perhaps the most important fact to remember when considering the question of archaeological gatekeeping and institutional resistance to revolutionary interpretation. Because, unlike theories that can be revised or abandoned as new evidence emerges, unlike academic reputations that rise and fall with changing fashions in methodology and interpretation, unlike the institutional frameworks that organize how we study and present the past, the physical evidence exists independently of our attempts to explain it. The stones do not change based on what scholars say about them. The symbols continue to display whatever patterns and relationships they display, regardless of whether those patterns are acknowledged or dismissed by current archaeological consensus. And this permanence of physical evidence means that truth, in some fundamental sense, does not require permission or validation from institutional authorities. That the symbols will remain available for investigation by future generations, who might bring different assumptions and methodological approaches to their interpretation, who might be willing to consider possibilities that current orthodoxy rejects, who might possess analytical tools or comparative databases or interdisciplinary perspectives that allow them to recognize patterns and meanings that remain opaque to current investigation. The builders of Göbekli Tepe invested extraordinary effort to ensure their message would survive in the most permanent medium available to them, carving it into massive stones that they then carefully buried to protect from weathering and damage. And this act of preservation suggests that they anticipated a long interval before their message might be recovered and understood. That they were thinking in timescales measured in millennia rather than generations. That they understood something about the cyclical nature of human knowledge and the possibility that what is known in one era might be forgotten and need rediscovery in another. And there is a profound irony in the fact that 11,600 years later, we have physically recovered their message, but methodologically prevent ourselves from attempting to decode it seriously, because doing so would require questioning assumptions about ancient capabilities that the field has spent generations defending, would require admitting that the primitive builders might have possessed knowledge we have not yet recovered, would require intellectual humility about the limits of our understanding, and institutional courage to pursue interpretations that threaten comfortable narratives. And until we develop that humility and courage, the symbols remain as they have remained for millennia, carved into stone, waiting for investigators willing to approach them with the assumption that their creators might have had something important to communicate, something worth preserving at extraordinary cost, something that remains relevant to understanding not just how civilization began, but what knowledge humanity once possessed and has since forgotten, knowledge that might prove essential to our own survival as we face challenges that our current civilization is only beginning to recognize. And perhaps this is the final irony of Göbekli Tepe, that the builders who lived through catastrophic climate change and who saw fit to preserve their knowledge in stone might have understood something about the fragility of civilization and the importance of preserving knowledge across catastrophes, that we, in our confidence about continuous progress and permanent advancement, have yet to learn, making their message not just historically interesting, but potentially practically urgent, if only we were willing to listen to what the stones are trying to tell us, rather than insisting that they can only be saying what our current frameworks allow us to hear.